Thank you, Dawn, for your gift of music. Well, a couple of years ago, I got a call from Beth. She's my bud. And they have 70 acres, but most of it's leased out. But she has this little farm section that has a horse and some goats and some chickens and some roosters and some, God only knows what. But her goats had babies that week. And they were really struggling because some of these babies were not doing well and were dying. And she had a pen set up in her kitchen that she had to get these baby goats into with heating, and then they had the bottles, and they were going to feed these goats all night long to try to save their lives. So my husband and I jumped in the car and we went out because she was screaming, help, help. So we went out, and I had on my boots because I've been to Beth's, and you stand in mud and other stuff we won't discuss right now. And then I had on my long raincoat because it was really cool that night. But it's a really neat raincoat, and it's got the lining inside that's all kind of warm and cozy. So we got out there, and the first thing I spotted was this little goat that was less than 24 hours old. Penelope. Beth names all of her critters. And this is Penelope, Penny for short. And she's standing in the corner, and she's just so I went over, and I picked her up. And I put her up against my stomach and wrapped the coat around her and just held on tight and just kind of was doing the mom thing. You know, it's like the mom thing. You hold the baby, you rock. Well, I was doing just fine, and all of a sudden I felt something tickle my chin. And there it was. I was nose to nose with the goat. I mean, nose to nose with the goat. Hello, how are you? Yes. We were both a little startled. So here I am, literally nose to nose with a goat. So what does a person do when they're nose to nose with a goat? You kiss their nose. So I began kissing her nose and kind of scratching her ears and rubbing her forehead between her ears. And then we had what I call a chat. And we had a chat, and I was discussing with her the importance of nursing properly because she had to get strong. So there I am, wrapped up with this little goat head, nose to nose, and I continued to kiss her and talk to her. Now, out of my eye, I could see Beth and my husband, and Beth had a rope around this mom goat's neck, and she's like, oh, she's trying to get her into a different pen. And my husband's on the south end of the goat, if you know what I mean, and he's shoving. Well, I didn't realize that when you do this with goats, it's kind of like when your car gets stuck in the mud and you kind of have to rock it. And that's what they were doing with this goat. They were trying to rock her forward and she'd come back and they'd rock her forward. And you see, I could have helped, but I was busy talking with the goat, which is far more important. So we had a chat, me and that goat. And what I remember at the time was, it's what I call a God moment. I don't know how many of you call it God moments. I call it God moments. When it's just this wonderful serendipity of something that happens that's just sort of kind of totally unexpected and precious and special. And I remember holding that baby goat and kissing her on the nose and scratching her ears. And to me, it was really a God moment. And I think what God did in that moment was allowed me a little tiny microscopic view of what it must be like to be a shepherd. And that connection we had. But I remember that, and Penelope did make it. Yes, she did take my advice, she did get stronger, and she did make it. So we talked today about Jesus being the Good Shepherd. In this context, the Good Shepherd means something different than, oh, good morning, she's a good person, he's a good man. Because Jesus and God have a relationship that is so close and intimate. And Jesus being our good shepherd is compared to Jesus' relationship with God. sheep because that person is paid to do it. They may understand that, well, I could get bumped. Well, I could get scratched getting the sheep out of the bushes. But they don't plan on dying. Because when the thieves and the robbers come, that hired person is gone. Jesus is the good shepherd because Jesus will not only put himself at risk, but will literally put himself between the sheep and the threat. He will protect the sheep knowing that he may die, and he does it willingly. When the robbers and the thieves of our lives come, whether it be people or cancer or fire, when the robbers and the thieves come, Jesus comes between us and the danger, even if that means laying down his life for us. Jesus sacrifices everything to meet the needs of the dependent, the needy, the hungry, and even us foolish creatures. When you really think about it, Jesus had unlimited power through God. There wasn't anything Jesus could do. I mean, Jesus could have had, literally, heaven only knows what. But what he chose was to be the good shepherd. The part that makes Jesus the good shepherd is the part where Jesus chooses to obey the will of God and put down his very life for the sheep. Jesus belongs to God, and as sheep of Jesus, we belong to Jesus who belongs to God. Are you with me? Kind of following that? Okay. You may say, I belong to the Hood River Valley Christian Church, but the reason that you belong here is because we all belong to the Good Shepherd. This is the promise that God, we belong to the Good Shepherd because he willingly obeys God and the will of God. How can you begin to put words to that kind of belonging? Jesus belongs to God. We belong to Jesus. He's the Good Shepherd, gave his life for us. How can you even begin to comprehend that kind of belonging? You all know that my friend Sharon died in February, and I will try not to cry. She was married to Bill. Short, stocky Bill. Orthopedic surgeon, and yes, he did have that basic surgeon's class on how to believe your God. And he had an opinion about everything. I mean, everything. And if you had an orthopedic issue, you wanted Bill for your doctor because there was nothing that Bill wouldn't do to take care of you. He would take on the administration. He would take on other doctors. If he had to walk up and down the street naked to get what you needed, he would have done it. So in this process, not all the doctors appreciated him. Not all the other surgeons appreciated him. The administration certainly did not appreciate him. And they had a lot of friends who didn't appreciate him. I, however, adored him. And when he got a little too much, I'd just say, oh, Bill, be quiet. And he would. And then we'd giggle, and we were fine. But one day I was talking with Sharon, and she said, Myrna, I'm not naive. She never criticized him, but she was not naive. She said, I know people don't like him. I know he irritates people. I know he pushes people away. And then she said something I've never heard before. She said, but I know the essence of the man, and I love him. And through their life, which included a 4-year-old son killed in a car accident, a daughter being diagnosed as profoundly deaf, a daughter who had severe juvenile diabetes, a son who had learning issues, and then her long process with stage 4 cancer. I do not think I've ever seen a couple do what they did in terms of loving and supporting each other. And it kept coming back to me what she said. I know the essence of the man, and I love him. And I think that that's what the scripture is about today. Jesus knows the essence of every single one of us and loves us. Jesus has intimate knowledge of each of his flock. We as the sheep know that we are under the watchful and unselfish care of the Good Shepherd. Sharon and Bill had a trust level with each other like something I have never ever seen. And I think we multiply that by 100,000 billion trillion, and that's what we have with Jesus. The need to belong is a deep human need. Some of us have been blessed with a life of belonging. We belong to a family, we belong to our spouse, we felt a sense of belonging with our kids, we felt like we belonged at our job. We felt like we belonged in Scouts. We felt like we belonged in our church. We felt like we belonged to that music group, and the list goes on. But some of us search every day for that sense of belonging. So when I was growing up, one of my mentors, Bonnie Alt, she was a special needs teacher, and she had special needs kids in her house, and she always had 5 to 7 to 10 boys living with her. And she thought I was her own personal servant, which I was more than glad to do. So she gets these little guys together. Now these are children, boys, that have been in institutions, they have been in foster care, they have physical issues, they have mental and emotional issues. And she decides, for the first time ever in the state of Montana, these boys need a Boy Scout group. And so she formed a Boy Scout group for special needs boys. Now what she did that was absolutely genius, but then she had one of those hearts. The first thing she did is she went out and bought them all uniforms. I will never ever forget these little guys in their blue shirts with their yellow ties. And of course they had to comb their hair, so their hair's all slicked back and still wet. This is in the early 60s. And she got picture after picture after picture of these little guys in their shirts. For the first time in their lives, they belonged. They belonged because they all had the same shirt. And some of the pictures with him, he's a typical 8, 9, 10-year-old, with their arms around each other, you know, sort of like strangling each other. But they're normal kids. For the first time in their life, they belonged because they all had the same shirt. And what she did with those scouts was amazing. But what really changed their lives was that they all had the same shirts, which proved I belong. These are my buds. Some people don't ever really get, for whatever reason, that sense of belonging. And I want to say to some of you clearly that in 35 years of doing counseling, what I heard again and again and again and again were people that said, the person that was the good shepherd on earth for me was my grandparent. Do not for 1 second underestimate the power you have as a grandparent to teach those grandchildren about belonging. Jesus knows us because he became flesh and dwelt among us. And I can promise you that goats and sheep can be smelly, dirty, obnoxious, stubborn, and they can wander off the paths. And they can refuse to go in the pen. But the Good Shepherd understands that we as the sheep can be smelly and dirty and obnoxious and stubborn and wander off. And yet he promises to give his life for us. How do you put words to that promise of belonging? So when I first started counseling in 1980, I was fortunate to connect with a man named Cliff Walter. Now, Cliff is vice president of the Seventh-day Adventist Conference. Now, their conference is like our regional, well, the UCC have a conference. They had a conference. We have regional ministers. And he was the vice president, and he was in charge of ministerial mental health. So he would call me, and he would say, will you do counseling with our family? So I was their main counselor for the Seventh-day Adventist Church for their clergy. He also sent me out numerous times to do workshops in churches. I was a consultant for them on the whole safety issue and inappropriate behavior at churches and yada, yada, yada. I never met the man. For 20 years, he and I talked on the phone 2 to 4 times a month. Never met him. But I knew him. I knew him. We understood each other's heart. We understood each other's faith. I got the essence of this man. For 20 years, I never met him. So then he was offered a chance to be an interim in South Salem at a church there for the summer. So he calls me and he says, we got to have lunch. So I'm in my office one day and I hear a voice say hello to my secretary. I went dashing out of my office, across the hall, threw open the waiting room door and went, hello. And we grabbed each other and we hugged each other and we jumped up and down. And we looked at each other and we hugged each other and we jumped up and down. And our secretary said, you look like you're 2 long-lost friends who have finally found each other again. And we said, yeah, that's really true. We've never met each other before. I knew that voice. And that voice, as musicians will tell you, has pitch and tone. That's why you never talk through rehearsals, because you have pitch and tone, and that screws up the notes, right? But his voice was more than pitch and tone. His voice represented to me the essence of who he was. And he died about 6 years later, and I went to his service, and everything everybody said, I just nodded. Yep. That was the Cliff that I knew. There are a million voices every day calling us. Technology, the TV, the noise in the streets, people yelling our names. We're surrounded by people and voices. Do you know the voice of Jesus when you hear it? One of the things that I read was a Gerald I'll have to ask Rod. Borchert? I don't know. I don't know if he wrote the commentary or assembled the commentary. But he used to live in Israel, and he gave these two examples. One was a shepherd who had to lead his sheep through the busy traffic in Jerusalem. He just walked down the street singing and whistling, and the sheep were right behind him. They knew his voice. He gives another example of 4 shepherds who had brought all their sheep together for the night. And in the morning, one by one, each shepherd would get up and start singing and talking and whistling. And his particular sheep would exit the entire crowd and would get right behind him as he led them off for breakfast. Jesus knows us. We know Jesus. Do you know the voice of Jesus when you hear it? Our job is to learn, to read, to pray, to study, and every day to know Jesus more and more. But that's what happened with Cliff and I. We were together so much on the phone, including praying together on the phone and talking. And we did what my friends and I call HDR. HDR, heavy, deep, and real. Most of our conversations were HDR, heavy, deep, and real. And over time, we really learned to understand each other. Knowing Jesus is intentional. It's a choice we make. This relationship goes 2 ways. We choose to belong. We choose to know Jesus. Jesus promises that we belong to him if we choose to follow his voice, which implies we have to know his voice. And I really challenge you to think about that and pray about that and discern that. Do you know the voice of Jesus when you hear it? Jesus is the good shepherd. What makes him good is that he willingly chooses to die for his sheep. That's the Christian context. Jesus knows his sheep and loves his sheep. That is what belonging is all about. We know Jesus. We trust Jesus. We hear his voice. And we follow that voice. This is what belonging is all about. I've always read the scripture that Shirley read today. And I had Shirley and John intentionally do the reading this morning because these are 2 people who don't just read the words, they live the words. And I wanted you to hear it from the voices of people who know the voice of Jesus. But for years, I've always read that first line, "The Lord is my shepherd.